I'm Mark Ketterforth. I'm the owner of the Ultimate Aquarium. Today we're going to be describing lighting sources and the function of light in corals. The seminar will be broken up into two parts. The first part will be an introduction to lighting, the quantity and quality of light. And the second part will be dealing with pigments involved with corals. We'll get started with the introduction to lighting, the quality and quantity. Okay. We're going to start with natural sunlight. The sunlight is comprised of the colors of the rainbow. If you took a prism and exposed it to natural sunlight, it will be separated into its constituent colors: violet, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red. Rainstorm would give you a very similar effect. The way the scientific community measures the quantities of these colors, they assign a number to them, and this is called a nanometer, and this designates the color of the rainbows. Now, I'm going to hand you out the first handout, and because we'll be referring to these wavelengths as the seminar progresses. Just pass those out for me.
Hey Mark, I got a question before
Yes.
we get too further. You know when they say like a 460 actinic? That's referring to the scale, right? So 460 would be the color?
Would be right about there. That refers to the wavelength of light. If you look on your handout, violet is assigned 400 nanometers, blue 440, green 490, yellow 540, orange 590, red 650, and above that is infrared. The handout I gave you gives you a good rough guide. Depending on which author you read, we'll change these slightly, but for our discussion today, this will work just fine. Any scuba divers in the room? Okay. Perhaps in your diving certification, they'll mention this acronym, Roy G. Biv. This stands for red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And this is the sequence of colors which are filtered out the deeper you go in the ocean. To illustrate this, I have another handout. And this handout's from one of my favorite Jacques Cousteau books. A diver with a palette of colors started off at 0 feet and then worked his way down into the ocean. And as you can see from these sequence of pictures, the red goes, the orange goes, the yellow goes, and the green goes. And you can see from the first picture to the last picture how blue and how kind of muddy all the colors are as the deeper you go. Okay. Any questions?
I got a question.
Yes.
So generally, how far down are most corals that we will get in our aquariums? So what color spectrums are they never really exposed to?
Generally, and it depends on the sophistication of the diver, some of these are just local indigenous people, and they're diving with just basically free diving. So we're talking swim trunk and a snorkel, and they are going down 15, 20, 30 feet. Okay. More sophisticated divers have scuba maybe down to 90 feet.
Okay. But for the general, just like an acro, is usually
you're talking probably 50 feet and less.
Okay, 50 feet and less. So most of them are never going to see red or orange.
Or you're not going to see, well, again, at the very surface of the water, you'll see red's going to be filtered out first, orange next, yellow next. So red only penetrates maybe, 10 feet, 15 feet or so, orange a little deeper, and so on. Okay, now I'm going to introduce you to the concept of a spectral curve. A spectral curve is simply a graphical representation of the quantities of the color of the rainbow. Now, if you took an instrument and measured the colors of the rainbow in natural sunlight, this is what the curve generally looks like. It's pretty much an even distribution of the different colors. You can see we have violet, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red, and it's a fairly even distribution. Now, as we go deeper in the ocean, this end of the curve starts to drop off because we're filtering out the red, the orange, and the yellow. Little disclaimer, I have a bunch of curves coming up. I drew them by hand. They're not perfect. This one is particularly not perfect, so I came up with another handout that illustrates this much better. Okay, everybody got one? Good. This graph is much cleaner than my haphazardous drawing.
We will hold it against you.
Okay, the top line represents the curve of natural sunlight found at 1 meter or about 3 feet. The next one down is about 15 feet. The next yellow line is about 33 feet, and so on. And as you can see, as I described, the right-hand section of the curve begins to drop off. So the water tends to get bluer the deeper we go again. Okay. Now, there are many different types of aquarium bulbs available on the market. All of them have different intensities that they can produce, and all have different colors that they produce. Going quite back in time, this is called the Grolix fluorescent. It's been around since the 60s. And if you look at the general configuration of the curve, we have this big spike in the red, and it looks very pink to the human eye. If we get into other types of bulbs, with a quick description, for example, this is what's called a power compact bulb, power compact fluorescent. This is a metal halide bulb. This is another version of metal halide called HQI. So again, all these bulbs have their own designation of spectral curve and output. And these are just some other examples of different types of bulbs. This is an actinic bulb, very heavy in the blue. This is a power compact, very similar to this one. You can see you've got blues and greens and a little bit of red there. This is an example of a metal halide bulb like this. It's a little, not quite so spiky, and it sort of fades as the curve drops down into the red end. Come on. Other types, the new types of bulb or lighting is through LED, light emitting diodes. And these are examples of some products that are on the market that you could choose from. This is the curve of what's called a Cree. This is what they call pool light. And as you can see, we have a big spike in the blue, and then a big hump around the green to the yellow-orange color. This is a brand called Orphic, and I'll come back and explain these two lines a bit later. This is a Kessel, you can see the curve here, and this is a Radium 20K metal halide bulb. This is another product made by Ecotex called Radiant XR30. Again, I'll come back and explain these two curves in a bit. Okay, we're going to get into evaluating the light quality now. What's very common is they'll have a designation called color temperature. And color temperature is rated on degrees Kelvin. Kelvin was a researcher many years ago who devised his own temperature scale like Fahrenheit did. You're familiar with Fahrenheit, this guy's been named Kelvin, so it's named after him. Used quite extensively in the hobby, you'll see 6,000 K, 7,000 K, 10,000 K, 14 K, and so on. Natural sunlight is about 5,500 to 6,000 K. Lower color temperatures, red, yellow, and higher color temperatures are white to blue. Please note that the color temperature that the manufacturer gives you does not denote a spectral curve. It's just sort of a rough guide to give you an idea what kind of color that the bulb produces. Unfortunately, the aquarium industry has sort of made this scale rather useless. There's no rules or regulations saying that you have to produce a true color-corrected temperature. They simply will make one up. So, the laboratory, the researcher will go, "Hey, Fred, what color temperature are going to make the new bulb?" And we'll go, 12,000 K. The better manufacturers will actually state on the package, this is not a true color-corrected temperature. So the moral of the story is don't get too attached to color temperature. You're looking for a spectral curve. Another parameter that's used for describing light output is something called color rendering index, and it's not used that much anymore. They have a standard from 0 to 100, 100 being natural sunlight. And if you are judging the quality of, say, cotton or diamonds, you want to look at those products under natural sunlight. If they're under pink or red or blue lights, it gives an artificial skew to the product that you're judging. For our purposes, generally, you're looking for a CRI greater than 90, and again, 100 being natural sunlight. Okay, we're going to switch to quantity of light. Quantity of light is measured by an acronym called PAR, or photosynthetically active radiation. This is the light that's usable for photosynthesis by our zooxanthellae. Zooxanthellae, for those who aren't familiar with, are symbiotic algae which lives in the tissues of coral. And through photosynthesis, they feed the coral by producing simple sugars and simple fats. There's a unit of measure for PAR. They were using called micro Einsteins. Einstein fell out of favor, so we're using micromoles, which is basically the same thing. They just don't throw in the Einstein. So don't get too attached to the units of measure. They seem to change them every few years anyway. So, this is the more common unit of measure now is micromoles. So
What does the micromoles refer to?
Micromoles refers to the quantity of light produced. It's just a unit of measure like meters or yards or inches or whatever. This is the way of measuring the amount of light coming from a light source. An old unit of measure was lumens lux, particularly with fluorescent tubes and metal halides and this type of lighting. They would rate the bulbs in lumens. Lumens is the amount of light a particular bulb produced. Obviously, the more lumens, the more light you would have. Lux is light received. Lumens is light emitted. So you're going to be losing light as it hits the area that you're trying to illuminate, and generally that winds up being less. So lux is light lumens falling on 1 square meter. Again, kind of an older unit of measure. It's not found in our literature that much anymore. But I thought you should be aware of it in case you come across it. If you're converting from lux to micro Einsteins, this is a simple little formula. It gives you a rough approximation of lux to micro Einsteins per bar. Okay. be a little more helpful. Light intensity is found on a coral reef. A particular researcher, this gentleman here, went to a coral reef, took a spectrophotometer and measured the quantity, or parameter, and took measurements at different depths. And at the surface, you're about 2,200 par, almost 2,300 par. 16 feet down, we dropped quite a bit down to 573. 32 feet, 321 par, and 64 feet, 183 par. Most of the lighting that we're dealing with, unfortunately in the industry, people are really using too little par. Very few people even have the 573 par. It's not at 16 feet. If you're at 8 feet or 5 feet, it's even going to be higher. Most of the par readings, most of the aquariums we're looking at are between 300 and less. So you'd be down in this 32-foot range. Any questions? Yeah.
Sorry.
I was just gonna ask, how come it's, we always talk about frying corals,
Yes,
you
uh-huh.
put them too high and you need to lower them down.
Correct.
And-
Correct. We'll be discussing that in the second half of the lecture. Now for some comparisons, I've listed some outputs in lumens for power contacts and T5 fluorescence. Just to make a comparison, T5 fluorescent is, I didn't have any small ones, basically half of this. Got very popular a few years ago. It was advertised that they are significantly more efficient than the standard PC. So we're going to go in and compare the lumen outputs. If we choose 55 watt PC to the 55 watt T5, you can see we have 4128 lumens of power contact to 4450. So not a tremendous amount of difference. The efficacy, the efficiency, which is basically the efficiency of the bulb, you divide the lumens by the watts, and you compare these two numbers. And it's 9% or so difference, more efficient. So we can see a small advantage to the T5 over the PC, but not a tremendous amount. Question?
How does that compare to par? I mean, if you have a 39 watt T5,
Correct.
20, how many par?
Par,
is there?
unfortunately, there's no, for lumens, there's no direct conversion. They have to be converted to lux and then converted to par.
If we were looking at lux, just real quick,
Yes.
is there any way that you know of, or do you know already offhand by chance, of those two bulbs specifically, which one has better penetration? Or is there
Well, since the lumen outputs are very similar, providing everything being equal, the reflectors are equal, the power inputs are equal, and so on, there's not much difference between the two. You're talking about 300 lumens.
Okay, so it's not a lot of difference in penetration
No.
as compared to like an LED,
No.
which penetrates a lot more.
No.
Okay, thank you.
Just a few more. When we get into the metal halides, the lumen jumps up quite substantially, so we're getting a lot more lumens per watt than we did with the previous styles of bulbs. Sort of the standard over the last 20 years or so. The LEDs, this information is actually getting dated. The LED technology is progressing very rapidly. They're getting more lumens per watt all the time. This is from about 2 years ago. You can see a 1 watt had about 50 lumens, 3 watt about 85, and 5 watt 130, which isn't a whole lot of lumens for each one. But they are improving. You can see the efficiency of the bulbs are pretty low at this point. We'll be talking more about that shortly. There's another type of lighting source that has come along in the last few years. It's called plasma lighting. And it is quite efficient. It has an efficacy of 172 lumens per watt and an output of about 50,000 lumens. So it's very, very bright. In fact, just for an interest, I've produced what we call a spectral curve for the plasmas. What's rather interesting about this source of light, it the spectrum of the output changes in relation to the amount of energy you put in. So a little bit of energy produces one curve, a moderate amount of energy produces another curve, and a high amount of energy produces yet another curve. And the curves vary from output to output. One of my customers actually has one of these plasma units. Very bright, quite intense. If you have the light,
Yes, two of them on one.
yeah. If you've got a lot of surface area to light, it's an interesting way to go. They are apparently coming out with, that's for a 290 watt, I think, unit. They're coming out with 400 watts. So a lot of public aquariums are using these.
It's a very, very white light.
Again, if you turn down the light, then it becomes bluer as the energy drops. The top curve that you see there is from the full output, and it makes it quite white in appearance. Okay.
Mark, can we get, I don't know if you have it coming up or not, a little bit of your opinion on what light spectrums we should be looking for? in
That's
light?
coming up.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay. Do we have any questions so far? No? No questions? Okay. Okay, before we switch to quantity, I want to touch on the rather standard in the industry, the aquarium industry, of that of replacing bulbs. About once a year is usually recommended we replace bulbs. And can you tell me why we replace bulbs?
Lose efficiency.
As in intensity, yeah. And there's another. Is anybody
The
else
spectrum changes.
correct too?
Might have not know what the third one is.
Okay. Generally, it's assumed that as the bulb decays, the output drops, so they get dimmer, and they become more red in their output.
Okay, so they lose intensity and spectrum.
And spectrum, correct. So a lot of people are spending good money and diligently every month or every year replacing their bulbs, spending their good money on brand new bulbs and bulbs that haven't turned red. And I think this is rather...
Actually, I replace mine every 6 months.
Right. I find this rather amusing that after they spend all this money replacing the bulbs, they run out and they buy, whoops, they go out and buy a red bulb. This is KZ's Fiji Purple T5 bulb. And you can see it has this great big massive peak in the red. I'm still trying to understand why they're doing this, other than what they're apparently attempting to do is to reflect red light off the colors of the coral to make them appear more red. They're not truly red, but they're just reflecting more
I
light.
think it was just well marketed.
But I just thought that was amusing. Okay. All right, we'll come back to those curves in a moment. Now we're going to switch topics. Okay. We're going to give an introduction to pigments and photoadaptation of coral color. As I was discussing before, corals possess zooxanthellae, which is a symbiotic algae that lives in their tissues. Through photosynthesis, the zooxanthellae produces food for the coral. If you want to refer to them as solar panels, these are called pigments. Well, we're going to discuss the pigments in the zooxanthellae first. There's several different types that are found in coral. And again, just think of these as solar panels which pick up a different color of light. It makes it a little easier to understand. Everybody's heard of chlorophyll A. That's the green pigment found in all plants. Zooxanthellae possess some chlorophyll A, chlorophyll C. This pigment here called pyridinum, not an attractive color. It's kind of a browny brick red, but it's one of the more prevalent pigments found in zooxanthellae. So the zooxanthellae, the pigments in the zooxanthellae themselves don't produce a great color for the corals. All they're doing is acting as a solar panel to absorb light from the sun. These are different colors that the pigments will absorb. And each pigment has sometimes 2 or 3 different peaks of absorption.
Well, can I ask a specific question?
Yes.
I'm noticing that I see a lot, everything is basically using blue.
That's my next
And
point.
some uses the red, and it looks like just green uses red, so if we were using those Fuji bulbs, it likely we would get more green color out of our corals.
Well, this is the pigment of the zooxanthellae. This don't really color corals that much, unless you burn away the coral's pigments, which we'll be talking about in a minute, and then these will be exposed, and you're generally left with brown. Okay? But do note that the color of light that the zooxanthellae utilize is pretty much in the blue end of the spectrum, with a smidge here in the red.
And then my question was though, if
Yeah.
you had more red color coming out, is it more likely that the greener colors would
You
thrive
might
because they have more red?
select for chlorophyll. Yeah. Okay. The next subject, there was an experiment done by some researchers, and what they did is they took 2 types of coral and they put them under a blue light, a white light, a green light, and a red light. And they're just lenses they shone the light through, and it filtered the light, so you're left with these different colors. And they looked at what happened to the coral over a period of months. They took the corals and they dipped them in a red dye, put them back, and what happens is, as the months go by, the new growth is the white ring of new calcium growth around. So they could measure how much the coral grew over time. What they looked at was the growth of the coral itself and the amount of chlorophyll A, the pigment, over time with these different colors. And if you just happen to take a quick glance, for example, the monochord here, the blue light 3.5, the white light 3.51, and it drops fairly significantly down to 2.54, and if you notice the red, the growth is quite poor. Same trend with the other species of coral, and the same trend with the pigments. So we get the better results with the blue and the white, the green and the red, with the red giving the poorest results.
Just so we understand, basically all things were equal. All these
Yes.
tanks were plumbed together, they all had the same filtration.
Yes,
So
correct.
the only difference was just the light.
Correct, and the same par values that were kept at, all treatments were kept at the same par, so there wasn't more light or less light in the treatment. It was just the color that they were looking at, to see the effects of the color on the coral growth. And it just, again, red gave the worst, green so-so, the white and blue gave the best results. Okay, now we get into the colors of corals. This is separate from our previous discussion. The pigments that color corals are formed in response to the amount and color of light in the systems, in the aquarium. They're used to protect the coral from photo damage. So they put up these different pigments to shade themselves and protect themselves from being damaged. These pigments, unlike the other ones, are non-photosynthetic. They don't offer any sort of direct photosynthetic energy to the coral. They protect the coral from UV damage. They protect the coral from excess light. And that is excess light that's photosynthetically usable. Now, there are 2 types of pigments found in corals. There's what's called non-fluorescing pigments, called chromoproteins, and fluorescing pigments. I will describe the fluorescing pigments first. These fluorescence is kind of an interesting subject. When light comes in and hits a pigment, it's just not reflected back. The light comes in, hits the pigment, and then another color of light is emitted. So you have one color coming in, and then another color coming out. And this what gives you that glowing kind of look with a lot of corals. The cyan fluorescent proteins and the green fluorescent proteins are very common. That's why when they're put under blue light, they tend to fluoresce. They get that bright green color to them. The fluorescing pigments, there is quite a laundry list. In fact, we're finding new ones all the time. There may be hundreds or maybe thousands, all with their specific colors that they absorb. The chromoproteins do not fluoresce. They simply reflect light. For example, this lady's shirt is yellow. It's absorbing the other colors of the rainbow and reflecting yellow light. The chromoproteins do the same. They simply reflect light that does not absorb. For those people who like aquapora, the chromoproteins are often found in the tips of the aquapora. You get these beautiful colors of blues and purples and pinks and oranges and so on. Okay. Now, we were talking about moving corals from one location to another. Several researchers actually looked at this. They've taken corals from the surface, say 5-10 feet, and transplanted them down maybe 30 feet. And then they've taken other corals from 30 feet and moved them back up to 15 feet. What usually happens, the trend is the corals that were translated from the lower surface to the upper surface usually didn't fare too well. The mortality was much higher. The corals that were translated from the surface down to the bottom tended to do much better. We also see this when we go to buy coral. Sometimes you get a piece of coral and it looks great, looks perfectly healthy, and you move from one lighting regime to another, and you take it home and it just goes, that's it. It just dies on the line. This is all a function of, well, other than water chemistry, as far as the pigments go. Pigment can't change on a dime. It takes days, weeks, or months to change the pigment structure. Here's this coral sitting out on the ocean, and some diver comes along, rips it out, sticks it in an aquarium and under a whole new lighting source, and goes, I got to change all my pigments. And if it can't change fast enough, it may not survive.
Just a point on
Yes,
that. This is one reason that a lot of the hobbyists look for aquaculture or marine culture corals, because they've been grown under these lights already, so you have a higher probability of them surviving and being healthy in your tank than, say, a wild caught coral.
The same thing goes with hobbyists who have one lighting source, and they've been using it for days, weeks, months, years, and then something new comes along, and they put a new lighting source over top of the corals without acclimating the corals, and then bad things happen, and they blame it on the lighting source. You didn't give the corals a long enough period of time to acclimate to the new lighting source. Again, it takes days, weeks, months to change this pigment structure around.
So is it better to lower the intensity? Slowly raise it?
Or shorten the photo period, lower intensity, give them some time to reestablish the correct pigments for this. Okay. Going to artificial lighting sources and their spectrums and how it relates to coral pigments and health. Now, I'm going to give you another handout. These are from an article from Sanjay Joshi, who's quite known in the industry for evaluating lighting sources. Can I have one of those back? Okay.
Oh, sorry. There you go.
Thank you. Okay. Now, our first handout, like that. This is the spectrum of natural sunlight found in coral reef at different depths. Okay. What he did was take, in this case, an Ushio 10,000K 400 watt metal halide, He looked at the spectrum, and then he superimposed it upon the curves for natural sunlight. In order to make it fit, he had to compress the natural sunlight curves down to these on here, the bottom 3 or 4 curves that you see here. Everybody got that? Okay. Now, if we're comparing the output of this Ushio bulb, you can see the top line is natural sunlight found at about 3 feet. We have these big massive spikes of light, some in the blue, that's about green yellow, and some in the orange. Okay? Everybody see that? This is far, if you measure these spikes, they're far and above what's naturally found in natural sunlight. So we now have a gross excess amount of these particular lights produced by this particular bulb. The corals have evolved on Earth millions and millions of years, and they evolved under natural sunlight. The pigments evolved under this natural sunlight for this period of time, and they didn't probably evolve the capacity to handle more than a few percentage points over natural sunlight. So if we're offering 10, 100, 1,000 times more light of a specific color than what they evolved to handle, they're probably going to get burnt up. The pigments are just going nowhere. I just can't deal with that much of that particular color. So the quest goes on to find a lighting source that more closely mimics natural sunlight without the excess peaks that might burn corals. And this is the next handout. I actually take one. This particular bulb is called a radium. It's metal halide. It's 20,000 K. And if you compare it to the Ushio, you can see we do have a large peak in the blue end of the spectrum, which seems to be well tolerated. But what we don't have is any other peaks of output that exceed the natural sunlight. See, the natural sunlight curve is right at the top here, and we have very, very, very little of output that exceeds the natural sunlight. So this bulb, with the exception of the blue end of the spectrum, mimics sunlight much better than the previous bulb. Radium metal halide is known in the hobby as probably one of the very best metal halide bulbs available. One of my wholesalers had a 450-gallon Stony tank set up with 4,000 watts of light over top of it. I was just amazed. The colors were phenomenal. We had even moderate light corals in there which weren't burnt at all. In fact, they were brilliantly colored. And I had to ask myself, well, why is this? How can we have 4,000 watts of light over this particular tank and have customers coming to me with a 200 par tank and says their corals are getting burnt up? Well, it's probably related to the spectrum. Again, this particular bulb has an output that is within the realm of natural sunlight. Any questions? No? Let's go back, and I want to take a look at some of the other manufacturers. Okay. Now, with either one of the handouts in your possession, you can take a look at what natural sunlight looks, and we're going to compare some of the other manufacturers of artificial light to those curves. So if we took, say, this output here and superimposed it on natural sunlight, we have the blue spike, which is probably acceptable. But see this big hump here? If you drew in the natural sunlight curves, it's going to be about like this. So we have this big hump of green to almost red light there that's not usable.
So on the scale we're seeing there,
Yes.
at about the 20 is where the natural blue.
Yeah, it'd be
sunlight-
something in that ballpark. So if you just took this curve and superimposed it on, say, the radian curve, you see we have this big, massive home curve. I want to point out this one. This is made by Kessel, and again we have the blue spike just like the radian, and a much lower output in the other colors of the rainbow. And this would probably, if you superimpose this curve on top of the natural sunlight curve, again, we'd probably be well within the natural sunlight output.
Would you say these are all LEDs?
These are LED, well, yes, these are LEDs. This is the radium, this is a metal halide.
The Kessel is an LED also?
Yeah, that's what I have on my front tank up front. So if you compare the Kessel to the radium, again, my hand drawings aren't perfect, but you can see it's a similar type of an output. What's interesting is a few years ago when I gave this lecture, this is another company called Orphic. They make an LED. Let's go back. The blue line here is almost identical to the tree. This is what they were offering about 2 years ago. A lot of the manufacturers now are dumping this type of a curve and going with more of a radian style curve. If you look at the green line here, this is their new one. This is actually what they're calling 18,000 DIF 100. I think it's what they're calling 18,000. You can see the green curve now is very different from their offering from two years ago. Again, if you superimpose this on natural sunlight, again, it'd probably be pretty well within the parameters of natural sunlight.
The Lynch Brooks LEDs are claiming to have that same spectrum as the Orphic, where they don't go with the big bump like the trees do.
Okay. This is another example, the Radiant XR30 from 2 years ago. We have this blue curve, which is slightly better than the massive pump, but we still have an awful lot in this area here. This is the first generation of Radiant, and then this is the second generation of Radiant. And you can see they've reduced the hump substantially. So basically what's happening is all the manufacturers are going to this radium style curve. Matches more of natural sunlight than the old style with the great big hump in it. Some of the complaints I've had from some of my customers when they turned up the white channel on some of these LEDs, it burnt the corals because you had this great big excessive amount of light that the pigments didn't evolve to handle. So this seems like the curve of choice. Some of the manufacturers still throwing in a little bit extra red. You're allowed to have red in the spectrum, but not more than you find in natural sunlight. So I have this excess amount of red, more than you would ever find in natural sunlight. The other manufacturers like Ecotech, they make Radion. We have, that is AI Vega, the Max Spectre. They all have programmable channels, so you can simply manipulate these different colors. The problem is, if you don't have a spectrophotometer which measures the spectrum you're creating every time you make a little adjustment, you're guessing. You're just playing mad scientist with it.
The Ecotech Radion comes with software that claims to do that for you. It shows you a curve as you adjust the different lights. I don't know how accurate that is, but they do have software that comes with it.
Does it measure from the tank itself, or just make
from the
extrapolation
machine of what it's pushing out?
Yeah, there's too many parameters that would.
I was just throwing out that they had that.
Okay.
The one question I had, I
Yes.
noticed all these curves, all these different lights. Everybody has these big giant spikes in the blue.
Blue, yes.
Is that just to try to reach the intensity and get the power that they need, that they're pushing into
It's
that
primarily for the human eye because it makes everything fluoresce. It gives you that pop that everybody looks for. Natural sunlight doesn't have nearly that amount of blue in it. The question becomes, can you overload it with blue? And I think as technology progresses, we get more and more output with these LEDs and some other lighting sources. theoretically, yes, you can over blue the tank where the pigments can only handle so much light. And there's a great number of pigments that absorb blue light, but eventually we may hit the point where it's going to overload those pigments and you can cause some damage. So blue to a point, but probably no more. Okay, any questions about the curves in relation to the corals?
Can we take a moment here and just basically, any questions on anything Mark has talked about so far? We're gonna take a real quick break and we're gonna do the raffle real quick. And then after that, we'll have part 2 and Mark can finish up with everything that he needs.
There's not too much more to go, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, in fact,
15
probably-
more minutes?
Yeah, I can probably finish this up.
Well, let's just finish it up.
Okay,
Okay,
good. Okay. Now, applying the pigments of the corals to spectrum and output. A few researchers have looked at intensity. And what's interesting, they've put corals under different intensities, say 80 par, 100 par, 400 par. And they looked at the pigments which were developed. And it's interesting, some of the pigments will only develop at low lights and diminish as the light intensity increases, and others only form at a higher light. So you can color the corals by intensity, by adjusting the intensities. We can select for different colors by choosing a different output. There's also the ability to select these pigments by spectrum. The pigments absorb different colors of the rainbow. We have a lot of hobbyists that love to run almost all blue on their aquariums, which is fine. As we've seen, it doesn't hurt the corals whatsoever. But you're going to narrow the palette of colors that might be available to that coral by only running blue, because there's only so many pigments that absorb that blue, and so you may only get so many colors out of your corals with blue light only. So it's important that we still have at least a little bit of output in the other colors of the rainbow. Particularly if you're an aquaphora fan, you've got these what we'll call chromoproteins. They tend to absorb towards yellows, mostly yellows and some oranges. If your lighting system doesn't produce that type of light, then you're not going to get those. You're not going to get those colors.
That may explain why people that run only white and blue LEDs tend to have a problem getting some coloration on their aquaphoras. They're not, that's, the name you just said, I can't remember it, but that may not be getting the yellows and oranges they need, so that's why they're not seeing the growth coloration.
Correct. If you don't have the color of light that activates the pigment, you're not going to get that color.
What do you mean by activating it? Is that something that the coral builds up over
Yes,
time?
yes.
With the exposure?
In relation to that color of light, again, it's a shield to prevent oversaturation of light. So it puts up these shields to keep it from being burnt. So if your light source only produces blue light, it'll only shield against blue light. If you have no other colors of the rainbow, you're pretty much looking at that palette of colors that are associated with blue light. As far as pigment concentrations, we saw that experiment earlier where they had the red filter and the green filter and the white filter and the blue filter. They did a similar experiment with the concentration of the pigments and pretty much got the same results. Unfortunately, they didn't have a white light treatment. They had the blue, the red, and the green. The red gave the poorest results, the green next, and the blue gave the best results in that type of experiment. So again, spectrum does dictate the quantity of pigments. Okay, this particular researcher used different light categories as far as par values, and this person defined very low light as 80 par, low light as 100 par, moderate light at 400 par, and high light at 700 par. And there's been other researchers who are recommending 1200 par for some aquas. Again, most of the aquarium sets that you're seeing are running pars 300 and less. So we can actually increase the amount of par available but the spectrum has to be correct. Now, finally, ways to develop these pigments. All these pigments that color the corals are made of proteins. Green fluorescent proteins, cyan fluorescent proteins, chromoproteins. The operative word here is protein. And proteins are comprised of amino acids. So by adding amino acids to the systems, you might be able to spark the growth of some of these proteins will help color the corals. Also, trace elements, iron, manganese, cobalt, so on, are also components of these pigments. The correct addition of these elements may also spark the growth of the colors. Too many people have gotten into the habit of just taking color light bulbs and bouncing it off the corals to give whatever color they're trying to get. This is not, in my opinion, the best way to approach this. You want to develop the coral's natural colors as best you can by the correct spectrum, by the correct intensities, by the correct environmental conditions, water conditions, and so on. Simply shining a red light or purple light off the corals just isn't the way to go.
Is there a natural source for these amino acids that we can add to our tanks, or is this something that we really need to just get a bottle of?
It's easy to just get the bottle of.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. One last subject, we were discussing PAR, which is the intensity of light. Having PAR alone may not be the best description. There's another definition called PUR, P-U-R, photosynthetically usable radiation. That's radiation that the coral can actually use. PAR is sort of a shotgun approach. We can have a light source that produces all yellow-orange light, and the PAR is fantastic, but the coral can't use it, any of it. So it's not a worthwhile venture to purchase that. I got some customers will run down to a hardware store and they go buy a $40 LED and go, it's really bright, but it's not the right color. Okay, so any other questions? That will conclude my time.
Well, thank you very much, Mark.